everybody, and welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. This week is podcast week at catholicculture.org, which just means that we're trying to highlight our new audio content a bit more to get people familiar with it who perhaps haven't checked it out yet or aren't aware that it even exists. So I've got with me today the whole Catholic Culture Podcast team. Of course, I'm the host of this podcast, the Catholic Culture Podcast, and I've got James Majewski with me of Catholic Culture Audiobooks. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Thomas. Glad to be here.
And I've got Mike Aquilina, host of Way of the Fathers with Mike Aquilina.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tom.
So I think it'd be appropriate to just give some personal details about how we got here doing the work that we're doing. And Mike, you were, of course, a guest quite early on in the Catholic Culture Podcast. I think it was like episode 11 or 12 or 13, something like that. We talked about your career a bit there, and we'll recover some of that same ground again here in briefer form. But since we've already talked about your career a bit, I think I'll start with James, and then we'll ask you a bit later. I'm going to delete all of this. I don't know why I'm saying this. And again, feel free to, both of you have projects that sort of converge at some points, dealing both with the Church Fathers to a large extent. So it'll be sort of interesting to see what kind of conversation emerges about that, coming at it from two different angles. James, so your project is Catholic Culture Audiobooks, and that is, for people who don't know, it's a series of free, very well-produced audiobooks that we have in podcast form and on the catholicculture.org website of classic works of Catholic literature, mostly focusing on the Church Fathers as well as, to a certain degree, on the writings of St. John Henry Newman. So you have kind of a unique avenue in approaching this with training in a couple of different areas. So could you please give us some of your background and a little bit of your life story that sort of leads you to be equipped to do this kind of project?
Sure. Yeah, well, Thomas, our friendship goes way back. You and I went to high school together and have been friends ever since. And I first went to school for philosophy. That was my main interest before dropping out to be a rock star. I was playing in a band at the time, and I thought, I want to pursue an artistic route. Well, this is often wont to happen with bands. The band broke up not long after that, and I was left in a vacuum. And so I auditioned for my very first Shakespeare play. And at the time, I was kind of bewildered. I didn't think that I would get cast in this community production of Macbeth, but the rest was history. After doing that performance, and it was a very small role, I continued doing Shakespeare in particular, but other classical works. I became quite enamored with performance. It was really in the context of doing theater that I discovered what I thought was a call to the priesthood. I think, there's something about saying words that are not your own, as a prophet does, or the performance of ritual, and the sacrifice of a priest. I was finding these things in the theater world, and my heart was so enlivened that I felt, well, I have to take seriously the possibility that God might be calling me to be a priest. So this is probably where my main credentials come in, or begin to come in, is that I went to seminary for 3 years, completed my college education there, got my philosophy degree, but also was exposed to the primary subject of this audiobook series, the Church Fathers. I had never read the Fathers before. I'd never really even heard of the Fathers before my time in seminary. And already I was finding, as you find with most material, any student of history will find that these texts are incredibly relevant to today. I might say the same about Shakespeare, in fact. Well, long story short, I discerned that I was not, in fact, called to the priesthood, and that instead I did want to pursue an artistic vocation. So after discerning out of the seminary after 3 years, I went to art school, which was quite a whiplash. I went from the Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus, Ohio, to California Institute of the Arts outside of Los Angeles, California. And there I did my graduate work in acting. So I hold an undergraduate degree in philosophy, an MFA in acting, and have found a sort of exciting convergence of these two interests in the audiobook series that Catholic Culture is sponsoring and that we've been developing together. I'm very blessed to be doing this project that, one, is so proximate to my interests as a performer and as an interpreter of text, but two, also is so enriching to get to spend time with these primary sources, to spend time with this material, and material that might otherwise seem intimidating to a contemporary audience, but actually is quite accessible and is rendered, I think, all the more so by being spoken out loud, by being sort of orally interpreted by a performer or by a reader, much in the same way that a lector at Mass might do the same thing.
So it's interesting that your beginnings with the theater, at least when we were in high school, sort of coincide with the beginning of our friendship, because our friendship was very much sort of like forged in the, maybe calling it a crucible is a bit much, although I actually don't know what a crucible is now that I think of it. But we were in the senior play at Seton High School in Virginia together, and you were the director and I played the lead role that you cast me in, The Man Who Came to Dinner.
That's right.
A comedy from, like, I don't know, 42 or 38 or something like that. So that's kind of an interesting connection there. Mike, how did you've been a freelance writer for a long time, and over time, the church fathers and the early church in general sort of became your specialty. How did you sort of meander your way in, if meandering is the correct characterization, into being a writer on the fathers?
Meandering characterizes my entire career, because I've just kind of wandered from one thing into another. And I certainly wandered into this field as well. I was working as a freelance writer in the Catholic field, in Catholic publishing. And I did a lot of work for Our Sunday Visitor, the big publisher at that time. I was editing one of their magazines, and I was a correspondent for the newspaper. One day, Bob Lockwood, who was president and publisher at OSV, called me and asked me if I would be interested in writing an introduction to the Fathers. And I told him I wasn't qualified to do that. And I recommended several scholars I thought might do it. He said, none of the scholars want to do it. So would you do this? So I said, sure. Now, Bob knew that I was an avid reader of the Fathers, and I had been for some time. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist, and I wanted to be like Schliemann discovering Troy. You just kind of put a spade in the ground, and pretty soon you find a temple, and then you find the temple's treasury, and there's all that gold. It just finding something important, significant that way. And then I found out that archaeological work is actually quite boring, and you spend a lot of your time just poking around at sand with a toothbrush. That did not interest me. I don't have that kind of patience. I don't have that kind of attention span, that's for sure. So reading in the Fathers was kind of my way of doing deep archaeology without getting dirty and without challenging my very short attention span. Bob recognized that. We were friends, and we had many conversations about history. So Bob recognized that, and he asked me to write just a low-level introduction to the Church Fathers. I told him I thought I could do that. I wrote the book, The Fathers of the Church, an introduction to the first Christian teachers. I tried to write it on my son's level. He was in junior high at the time. I wrote it so that he could read it. And before I knew it, that book was being used as a seminary textbook. So I guess it succeeded.
I'm going to take a few minutes now just to talk about how these podcasts came to be in the first place. So in the case of the Catholic Culture Audiobooks series, my dad, Jeff Muris, the founder and head of CatholicCulture.org, and I had been talking about ways to potentially expand the site into other forms of media. We've always been a very text-heavy site, and neither of us were particularly interested in just sort of adding more images and stock photos to put at the top of articles and things like that. We wanted to expand content into other forms of media. And this also has to do with the fact that he is in his period of figuring out how to transition into retirement, where he still wants to keep writing, but trying to find ways to sort of hand things off and keep the site going, if that's God's will, into the future with new generations of readers. And one of the ideas I had suggested was, well, maybe we can do audio readings of some of the material on our site. So we have commentary, we have that's original to us. We also have a quite substantial back library of all sorts of things, from papal encyclicals to the church fathers to articles that we've clipped over the years from older print publications. But anyway, so I had suggested that this is something maybe I could do. Later, James and I had been talking about getting him involved with CatholicCulture.org in some form. And he had the same idea independently of me of doing a series of audiobooks of, at the time, he'd suggested papal encyclicals or the church fathers or something like that. And we kind of settled on the church fathers as the thing to do. And also John Henry Newman, largely because he was being canonized around the time that the series was going to launch. So that was kind of a providential convergence of both of us having the same thought. So we thought, well, that's probably the Holy Spirit. Then in the case of the Way of the Fathers, this is something that, an idea that I had shortly after we had our first, we had our podcast conversation early in the Catholic Culture podcast run. And I had gotten to know you a little bit after you had sent me some nice emails about articles I had written, and we sort of had a pretty quick rapport. I think I had messaged you on Facebook and I said, Mike, somebody should do a podcast that's like a history podcast about the fathers of the church. And he was like, yeah, you should do it. I was like, well, I don't really want to do that. That sounds like a ton of work. And I was really kind of trying to hint that you should do it because you already have a lot of knowledge and sort of the skill set built up to do this with a lot less sort of background prep work than someone like me would have to do. And then a while later, I guess, I don't know, a year later or so, we were talking about launching some more podcasts. And I thought, as long as we're talking about this, I'd love to ask Mike if he would really be interested in doing this for us. The reason I wanted to do a podcast, a history podcast, a scripted show on the fathers, is in large part inspired by some of the other great ancient history podcasts that are out there. Most of them are done by amateur historians who are very enthusiastic about the area that they're covering. There's the history of Rome was a really popular one. The history of Byzantium is another one that sort of continued where the history of Rome left off. But the one I was particularly inspired by was a podcast hosted by an expert in the field, which a lot of them aren't, but this one is, which is Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, where he just goes through the history of Western philosophy from the pre-Socratics on in a narrative form as a continuous story without skipping from great figure to great figure. And he wanted to really give credit to all of the minor figures. He also wanted to give credit to the role of theology, even though he's not a Christian, in pushing philosophy forward. So he has a very generous and broad view of what constitutes philosophy. So he does have a whole series of episodes covering the contribution of the church fathers to philosophy, for example. Anyway, I was inspired by that sort of continuous narrative approach. And I thought, we're still in early days yet, podcasting, there's kind of a glut of podcasts in the wider world now, and they're very well known. But in the Catholic world, it's still relatively undeveloped. Most of the shows that are out there are kind of basically talk shows of one form or another. There's a lot of priests who have put their homilies out there in podcast form, which is great. There's Catholic radio shows, which are also released in podcast form on a daily or weekly basis. And there's a number of shows that are just kind of like, we're just two average Catholic guys talking about pop culture or the latest issues in the church or whatever. And my shows, of course, is an interview show. So it's not too different in that sense. But in terms of the broader array of things that you can do with a podcast that are happening out there, like a history show or audio dramas or all these different types of things that people are doing with this audio medium, I didn't see that happening in the Catholic world. So on a broader level with these two projects, what I was hoping to do was to sort of kick that off and take Catholic podcasting a step forward. And I was excited about the opportunity to go where people hadn't gone before in the Catholic world. That's one of the reasons that I'm so excited about the fact that we have these two shows. So I'd like to ask you both a little bit about your process of making these shows. Mike, you already have a lot of background knowledge about the church fathers. We can see your giant library behind you. I mean, the listeners can't, but I can on the video. You've got a ton of contacts in the academic world. You are keeping up with the literature and the new discoveries in the church fathers and the early church. But you do write for more of a popular audience, and you make a point of making things very accessible and very concise, and also trying to make things edifying perhaps in a more direct way than sort of the first rung of scholarship or highest rung of scholarship would do, because often they're focusing so much on details and just moving things forward an inch at a time that the big picture can be lost. I mean, we hope that Catholic scholars would find ways to make it edifying, even just to a scholarly audience. But so what I want to ask is what your process is in preparing these scripts and in general in your writing, in distilling all of this scholarship down into something that is accessible and entertaining and also hopefully spiritually edifying.
Yeah. I don't know that I've ever thought about it. My goal is always to entertain and to inform. I want people to be aware of their own history, what made them who they are and what they are. And I want to keep them on the line. I want to keep them listening. So I've worked in a lot of media down the years. I've done television and radio and that sort of thing. So I guess I kind of fall into it as far as technique goes. And I hope I have a clear sense of my audience. I've written over 60 books now, and most of them are about the early church. So I think I've hit upon, a narrative technique of telling stories and providing information, giving it to them at a pace they can absorb and that they can focus on. So my goal, as I said, is to entertain them and to inform them. And ultimately, to get them over to James's files. I want to draw people into the works of the fathers and give them a nice, gentle, easy ramp into those works so that they kind of know what to expect when they get there and they're prepared for it and they can enjoy it. Once people do get into that world, once they find an imaginative entry into that world, they find it so enjoyable. It becomes something like doing genealogical research. A lot of it is just a slog until you get to this point where suddenly you realize you're looking at this painting of your great-great-great-great-grandfather, and he looks like me, right? I see that, Thomas, on your Facebook page, right? So, there's a certain thrill that goes with studying the Church Fathers, and it's very similar when you're reading Justin Martyr, who's writing in 150 AD, or you're reading Ignatius of Antioch, who's writing in 107 AD, or you're reading the Didache, which was set down to paper in 48 AD. You read these texts and you recognize your parish church in those texts, and you realize what you're part of. You see the continuity, and you see how this heritage has been passed from generation to generation. And I think a certain gratitude wells up. I know it does for me, even now, after decades of studying this stuff. From what I hear back from readers, they experience the same thing. They experience a sense of gratitude for what their ancestors have done. And I suppose the fact that I've had the privilege of writing 60 books, mostly on the Church Fathers, says something about the interest in the Church Fathers that's out there. People want to know about the early church. If you think about the kind of market the Dead Sea Scrolls have found over the past 70 years now, that's pretty crazy. It's so nerdy, it's so geeky, and yet it has been a cottage industry for 3/4 of a century now. And I think that's because people have this deep desire to know where they've come from and to see that obvious strain of continuity between their ancient ancestors and themselves.
Nice.
So it really sounds like it's more of an intuitive process for you, the distillation aspect.
I think so, because you know what? I never did any prep to do anything that I've done for a living. I did study English. I studied English writing, and I had some good teachers. I started working in publishing when I was 19 years old, and I had a very good mentor, the vice president I worked under. But all these years, I've been learning on the job and trying to develop the skills as I was using them and to put them to good use as I was learning them. I've never had the leisure to kind of sit back and learn the trade. That's why I was very grateful to you when I started doing this, because I'd never, ever, 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 ever spent 2 minutes working on the electronic end of the thing. Usually when I'm doing television or radio, I show up, there's a microphone sitting in front of me, I say my piece, and I go home. Now this time, in order to do a podcast, I had to learn kind of the basics of production, meaning turning the machine on, turning it off. For me, that was a pretty steep learning curve because I'd never done anything like that. So you had to walk me through all of that, Thomas, and you're still walking me through it today. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because it has been a steep learning curve, but at the same time, you've been able to do it. And now that you've done, I guess, 8 episodes, you know how to make sure your mic is working properly, and how to use, I guess you use GarageBand.
I do.
To record. So the barrier to entry for creating a podcast is not that high. And I'm not so much saying that to get people to start podcasts as to get the people who are starting podcasts to realize it's not that hard with today's technology to have a podcast that sounds good. I'm just going to go on a tangent, because I've heard so many podcasts that I would have loved to listen to, but there's like one thing that they could have made, like one really easy change that would have made it like 5 times more listenable in terms of the audio quality or things like that. And that's one of the factors that has made, I think, some of the early church history podcasts out there, they haven't gotten over that problem of just sort of having some of the basic technical things right. But I think people think it's more expensive, for example, than it actually is. I mean, I think the equipment you're using didn't probably cost more than $100, not counting your computer, but the actual mic and the audio interface definitely under $150, I'm sure. James's setup costs a little bit more because it's an audiobook program, and we wanted to have a really good sort of rich sound for his voice and everything. But I'm just saying this as an aside, because I think people who are listening, who may be involved in making recordings, if not a podcast, and putting them on YouTube or something like that, you can get a fine sounding mic for $60. I mean, the one James is speaking on now, I think costs $60 on Amazon. And you can plug that directly into your computer, or you can get an audio interface for another, $60 or $80. And that's really all you need, and you're good to go. So I just think people should know that they shouldn't settle for poor audio quality because they think that having good audio quality is going to cost them an arm and a leg. If you're going to make a podcast, I think it's worth spending $100 to sort of get that sound quality, because if you spend $100 on your equipment, the gap between you and the most successful podcasters out there in sound quality is not very high. After that, it's all just a matter of finessing and getting sort of the exact sound of your voice that you want. But in terms of having a professional level audio quality, the bar is super low. James, I'm interested to hear about your process in preparing these readings. We put them out at a fairly rapid pace, and it's something that you've had to tweak over the months since we started in October, or maybe since you started preparing for this in the summer, both on a technical level of reading and on a deeper level of engaging with the text. What is the process that you go through for each piece?
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that. Well, first, I'll just say that I want to echo what you are saying regarding the technical components. Like Mike, there was a bit of a learning curve for me in terms of production, having to kind of figure this out on my own.
And you edit all of the audiobooks yourself as well.
That's right. So I think one of the things that was important to us in producing this from the beginning was that we would be able to do it in-house. So I record everything on my own. I edit everything on my own. I end up mastering it and then publishing it on my own. So it's all on the job learning. And I'm really proud of the product that we've been able to come to. And We might have dropped a little more change on my equipment, but certainly not a prohibitively large amount. Anyway, to speak to the process itself, at the beginning, it was really just about sourcing texts. So I had a little bit of familiarity with the fathers, but I spent a solid month just reading material and seeing what was working and what wasn't. At the beginning, there had been some thought of strictly doing the letters from the fathers, because I found so many of the letters to be so particularly relevant and candid. And so in that way, kind of lending themselves to a podcast reading where you're sort of hearing this saint whispering into your ear. There was a little bit of an effort at the beginning to nail down the exact vocal quality that was going to be used. I remember on one of the test runs, you remarking, yeah, why does it sound like St. Ignatius is whispering sweet nothings into my ear? And then I think, I also played with doing a more declamatory reading. But really, what was important for me from the beginning was getting out of the way of the text. I have the happy privilege of getting to serve as an occasional lector at Mass, and it really grinds my gears when a lector's reading gets in the way of the text or sort of places itself in between the audience, or in this case, the congregation, and the text, which in Mass is the Word of God.
Yeah.
So it cannot be read the way that really anything else is read, but certainly not the way a dramatic text is read. Now, you can do dramatic readings of that text, certainly. I'm going on a bit of a tangent here. The book of Job, for instance, really dramatically exciting literature there. There's a context for that, but in the Mass, the word is functioning differently. And so our reading has to function differently. And that was a sensibility with which I approached reading this material. I didn't want my interpretation, certainly not my performance, to place things on top of, and even worse, in between the text and the listening audience. And that's trickier than you might think, because it's not about delivering a rote recitation or a sort of muted performance. It's not like reading something deadpan is going to make it more comprehensible. So what it is about is adjusting your reading and even your interpretation. There are interpretive choices that need to be made, but not so much with reference to emotion or action, which are questions you would ask yourself in a dramatic reading, but more about
the logos of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So you might call them boring questions of grammatical structure, how a sentence is organized. The Church Fathers, as with many ancient texts, are a lot more, how do I put it? Many of them are much less averse than we are to expressing things in long sentences and ideas. This is kind of a hallmark of certainly Shakespeare performance, is oftentimes you get one sentence that's comprised of many lines. You almost get sometimes paragraph-long sentences.
And Newman is the same way.
Correct. Really any great prose. But we have a tendency nowadays, and certainly in speech, to sort of break everything up into tinier chunks. And that can be a great temptation of a reader of this material, is instead of delivering something as a single thought, a multifaceted and colored thought, breaking it up into sort of isolated, bite-sized chunks, thinking that that's going to make it more comprehensible, but really the result renders the idea totally disorienting. You become lost in this forest of these sort of monad, bite-sized expressions that were really part of an organic whole. So for the reader, and this certainly applies to reading scripture, the Psalms perhaps, there needs to be an attentiveness to what an instructor of mine calls sense stress. So where do you stress the sense? For me, I target verbs especially. Any good classical actor would probably tell you something similar. Verbs are where the heat is, where the goods are. So I begin right off the bat by hitting those verbs. But you might get a number of verbs in one sentence. Well, then you got to give some thought to where's the primary stress here? Where's like the secondary action or the secondary verb? So certainly subordinate clauses become relevant. Kind of doing old school diagramming of a sentence, that can be really helpful with this kind of work. So at the beginning, before we launched this podcast, I was doing a lot of that, probably an unsustainably long amount of time spent breaking down the text and really sort of creating a score that I could then bring with me into recording and kind of follow it as a score. That became simplified over time. So now I have a much more concise way of annotating my text. And sometimes I don't even do that. Really, it can be enough now for me to go to a text 1 or 2 times and then find the sense stress, find the meaning in recording. So what hopefully sounds in the finished product like one seamless take usually is not. There are times when I'll have to stop and sort of wrestle with a sentence 2 or 3 times before it comes out quite the way that I want it to. One of the things I'll often do is render a few different readings of a sentence or of a paragraph, and then I can go back in post-production and pick what sort of highlights the meaning the best. But yeah, I hope that this is something that our listeners find in listening to these texts, is that they're not so much thinking about the particular performance choices that I'm making, like, oh, he sounds really emotional there. Maybe he's really sad, or, oh, Ignatius got angry, No, I want them thinking about the text. So there's going to be a little bit of a space for emotion. I love reading Newman because the way that he writes is, I think, filled with a kind of weightiness, especially when he talks about the last things. And so there is some room for that, but you got to be really delicate with it. And it's so easy to tip that too far. And then all of a sudden, an audience is no longer thinking about the text. They're thinking about this doofus who's reading it and sounding like a thespian.
Mike, I'm curious. I'm sure that when you're writing your books, you're still learning new things. These podcasts are a little bit more bite-sized and a little bit more sort of general in their approach. So I'm curious if you have learned anything new about the Fathers so far while doing these.
I'm always learning new things about the Fathers and new things from the Fathers every time I go into these texts. The texts that have survived are mostly the texts that are inexhaustible. So much of the rest of it has just disappeared. It's vanished. Think about it. There was no printing press. There was no way of preserving texts. So these are the documents that have been carefully preserved for 2,000 years at great expense, because you had to hire a scribe to do it. And it wasn't on acid-free paper. So whatever the scribe did might last 20 years, if you're lucky. And then you'd have to have it done again and again and again. These are the texts that have survived because they're inexhaustible. Every time I go over them, I'm learning something new. The other thing about it that's important in my work is my sure knowledge that these authors are not dead. These authors are very much still alive, and they can be invoked. I can ask their help if I'm having trouble interpreting their text, and they'll intercede for me. These are saints of the church. They're family to me. And so I can go to them, and that's something I do. I don't want to sound like some kind of airy semi-mystic here, but this is something that really is an advantage to us, and we should make use of it. I'm not going to make any claim for special revelations about the Shepherd of Hermas or anything like that. I still have the limitations of knowledge of what's on the page. I have what's on the page. I have what others have found through research. But I believe that the saints and the angels do guide us to the knowledge that we need to have. And they usually do that by guiding me to sources, other sources, illuminating sources, and helping me to find the thing that's elusive to me at the moment. So yeah, I guess all of those things make this work rewarding to me, even after 30 years of doing it.
James, I'm sure you must do the same thing. You
Absolutely.
must invoke the saint whose work you're reading, if it is a saint, in prayer.
Yeah, well, so we actually launched our podcast, the Catholic Culture Audiobooks series, to coincide with St. John Henry Newman's canonization. And when we were initially developing the idea for this audiobook series, Newman was not part of the conversation. And it was because of his upcoming canonization that the idea kind of occurred to me, hey, this is a great time to get in good with a saint and sort of invoke his patronage on this project. And
he's the patron for both of these, The Way of the Fathers and Catholic Culture Audiobooks.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me because looking at Newman's text, first off, they have the same kind of thing that the Father's texts do. He reads almost like a church father, but contemporary. And that was something that ended up being a real advantage to adopting the church fathers and John Newman as our primary sort of subjects on this audiobook series, at least at the beginning, because you get a real sense of the continuity of the church and of the spirit through history that's animating these writers in the first, second, third centuries and animating this great modern theologian in St. John Henry Newman. But it's also very appropriate because he himself was very inspired by the fathers and they played a large role in his conversion. And so it really felt kind of providential that we were beginning this project at this time. You know, I say that we sort of tagged Newman, but it very well may be and is probably more likely that he tagged us. And so I invoke his particular intercession for all of the work that I do. But then certainly when I'm covering any of the fathers, it's very gratifying to know that I can pray to them directly as well, both in the prep work of first encountering their text and then in the actual delivery of it.
Another thing about Newman I'd like to say is that he was a master of media, emerging media. His early life coincided with the emergence of the magazine and these mass-produced newspapers, and he was a presence in that field. He took it up with gusto, and he helped to develop the use of these things for religious purposes. He was a master of media. Now, eventually, that came to bite him because it was these very media he had helped to build up who went after him after his conversion and tried to make a villain of him. But this is something that Newman, I think, would have appreciated in our time. He would have loved the fact that James is reading his work in a podcast.
Well, it's funny, I did a little bit of reading about his actual oratorial method. There's obviously no recordings of him, audio recordings, but there is written record of his manner of preaching. And apparently it was quite sort of unassuming and quite understated, which of course is not the way that I read. And I almost think that you could take a lot of his sermons and really blow them up a lot larger than I do on the podcast. There really is so much power in his writing, but it's remarkable to me to think about him, this sort of, unassuming figure behind the pulpit, reading these incredible sermons, some of the best of the whole history of Christianity, and really captivating his listeners, but in a way that wasn't making use of, maybe what we would think of today as the sort of cliched, reverend preacher, fire and brimstone and televangelists and what have you. I'll say as another aside in speaking to the process is that was definitely something that we wanted to avoid with this audiobook reading series. I think that culturally, that's where our minds go when we think of sermons and when we think of preaching. And when you look at this material, whether it's from Newman or from the fathers, sometimes there's a bit of a bite to it. But these are men that are really, they're saints. And so they're really speaking from the heart. Newman's Episcopal motto, heart speaks to heart. I really hope that that's something that collectively we're all kind of able to reach for and achieve in these audio offerings that we're bringing to people.
I'll add my testimony to what you said, James. Anyone who knows me personally knows that I'm kind of an excitable boy. I'm an enthusiast. I just get really revved up when in conversation and when I'm talking about the fathers. And that was another thing that Thomas had to work on with me, was not getting so excited, not letting my voice go to such a high pitch. So it was funny. After a couple of my podcasts were out there, one of my daughters called me and said, "Hey, I've been listening to your podcast. It doesn't sound at all like you."
That's really funny.
She said, "I told my husband it sounds like the sleepy dad voice."
That's funny. Newman, there's the famous aesthete Matthew Arnold went to hear him preach, and we have some comments from him on Newman's way of speaking and his voice. And I can't remember exactly what he said, but he basically said he had like the most beautiful voice he had ever heard, and it was worth going just to hear that voice. This is Matthew Arnold, who maybe wasn't that interested in the actual content of what Newman was saying, but just thought his voice was so beautiful that it was worth going to hear him preach. And what you say about Newman being like the fathers too is interesting, because you do, with the fathers, at least, especially the figures we've read so far, they do feel like, people. It doesn't feel like a detached sort of academic thing. You do feel the person behind the text very often. I think that would be true with how any saint would write theology, or even a saint who is an academic. You would get that. But you feel with Newman, you feel both the spirit, but you also get sort of the flesh and blood and sort of the concerns of his heart and his sentiments, and you feel the warmth of a living person when you're reading his writings.
I think that the fathers themselves were masters of media, and we have them to thank for the predominance of the book. It did not emerge as the premier communications technology until Christians came on the scene. The scroll dominated, but the Christians needed something that they could lay on an altar. It would lay flat, and they could turn pages. They needed something that they could read from in a liturgy. And so the book became dominant as Christianity grew and became the dominant cultural force in the Roman world. So I think the fathers had this keen sense of media, that we want to use the best means of getting the gospel out there. The early Christians did not invent the book, the Codex, but they made the most of it, and they made it emerge as the dominant communications technology. So I think this is natural, what we're doing. This is a natural thing. It's no accident, I think, that it was a Catholic philosopher who was the dominant voice in communication studies in the last century, Marshall McLuhan. He could say the medium is the message because he knew Jesus Christ.
That's a really good point. I'm glad that our conversation has kind of ended up here, because I think that this is what from the beginning has been the most exciting part of this work for me, and kind of the animating principle is that, well, we get to join this great tradition of using the media to spread the gospel. And I may not have written these words that I'm reading, but I am recording them.
Yeah.
And that's so exciting and humbling and terrifying. This material that we're working on, all of us, this will hopefully be what's called evergreen material, that once it's out there, and people can listen to this stuff. They can go through the history of the fathers. They can listen to your interviews, Thomas, that I've been a fan of since the beginning, and hopefully get something out of these audio recordings of literature that might otherwise seem intimidating to people, or something that they might not otherwise figure out a way to work in the time to take a look at. I think that this is what makes this work important. This is why I'm doing this work. And I know that this is why Catholic Culture does the work that it does in its mission. So I think with this being podcast week, remiss not to sort of make this appeal to our listeners to join us in this, that this is worthwhile to, even if we're only able to continue this work for, a certain amount of time, what we do get accomplished will live on, and hopefully be able to enrich people's spiritual lives for, who knows, as long as the internet's around.
I couldn't afford to do this if I were not getting paid for it. It takes up too much time. You have to put in the research, you have to put in the writing, you have to put in the prep. So, I mean, if people are not contributing, it's not going to get done. So I'm profoundly grateful for the people who are making this possible, and I pray for them every day.
I hear. I will echo that as well. This is a niche sort of interest that we're appealing to. It's first off just Catholics, mostly Christians perhaps, and perhaps even a smaller subsection of that. But I think that this material, certainly audio readings of the fathers might not have a ton of commercial appeal, but it does, thank God, have an appeal to our audience, to Catholic culture's reader base, and hopefully more than that, more generous benefactors who can keep this work going, this apostolate going. And I would love to keep doing this for as long as we're able to keep it going.
Well, thank you for that stirring pitch, James, which you reached in a very organic manner. So I'd be remiss here if I didn't mention that you can donate specifically to support CatholicCulture.org's audio content by going to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. You can set up a recurring or one-time donation. It's all tax deductible. And like I said, if you go through that link specifically, it goes to support the audio work. And even if you don't want to donate right now, just if you haven't heard James and Mike's podcasts, do yourself a favor and go to catholicculture.org/podcast, singular, and you can go find the home pages there of all three of our podcasts, Catholic Culture Podcast, Way of the Fathers, and Catholic Culture Audiobooks, and check those other two out if you haven't yet, because they are really worth listening to. So, James, what has been the effect on you personally of going through these texts at the level that you are?
That's a question I ask myself every day, man. What is this doing to me? I mean, it's not like any other material I've worked on. Certainly as an actor, this is material that speaks directly to my heart. I cannot sort of take a detached attitude, and it's such a blessing to get to spend time with this text, researching it, working on it, then speaking it. At first, I was quite intimidated because I thought, oh man, how am I ever going to say these words? I'm not a saint like these guys. I guess I got to get working on that. And well, that's true. The bar has been set, right? And I kind of hope that is the experience for anybody encountering these texts, certainly the fathers. So the bar has been set, and it's not an impossible goal. We know that we're all called to holiness, to profound holiness, that God's grace is sufficient, and that our weakness is not a problem there. In fact, we can boast in our weaknesses, and that then the power of Christ is made effective in us. So I know that our listeners know this, but I certainly needed to be encouraged by this at the outset of this project. I needed to sort of look myself square in the face and say, no, these texts are not just for some great saints in the past, that these are for me too, and that I can speak these words with authority because these are my words also. And if they're not, well, then I'm going to do my darndest to get in line, to respond to grace, and to listen to what's being said to me through these texts. I think that, conversion is always our work, but there has been no small conversion worked on me in the few short months that we've been working on this audiobook series. It's a huge blessing. And if that can be communicated out to others who are listening to this material, then, oh my gosh, I just couldn't think of anything better. This is tremendously rewarding.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I find that when I am dealing with something that is the product of a saint, on my podcast, it is a different experience. I mean, right now I've been reading the poetry of the English martyrs for an upcoming episode, which I'll be recording in a couple of days. And these are poems that some of them were written while the person was in prison awaiting his death, or in some cases, the person kept having a stay of execution, and it was almost worse because he didn't know whether he was going to die or not. And so the old flesh kept, rearing its head and hoping to live. And he kept having to do these meditations on death and on the instability of fortune and things like that to keep himself in check so that he wouldn't lose his resolve. So when you read that material, I hope that all of the things that I cover on the podcast are edifying in some form. But when you read that material that sort of gets to the heart of reality, it does sort of force you to in a way, sort of confront the importance of your work and the attitude that you take toward it. I'm sure, Mike, that you feel the same way about your decades working on the Church Fathers. It's almost like the double-edged sword, because if you do manage to be detached and sort of indifferent or lukewarm towards it, then it's more dangerous than if you had never encountered them at all.
And the work that they began is still happening today. It's the same project. It's not as if it stopped at some point in the past and now we just remember it. No, I mean, it's still happening. And I'm glad that you, Thomas, are kind of recording that in real time in your conversations with some of the artists I really admire today, for example, who are building up a culture, and a Christian culture, a specifically Catholic culture. People like James Matthew Wilson and Samuel Hazo. Those are recordings for the ages, in my opinion. So it's still happening today, and these people are still making us aware of what the demands are on us, and I'm grateful for that as a consumer.
I think we should probably wrap things up there, but hoping we've given people a reason to check out Catholic Culture Audiobooks and Way of the Fathers. If nothing else, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to learn about the Fathers, but I'm hoping that the one that has struck people most is the account of the profound personal impact that they can have on us, not just as people who are curious about the history of theology or church history or the ancient world, but as people who are seeking holiness. So James and Mike, thank you so much for working on these projects and for coming on the show to talk about them today.
Yeah, you bet, Thomas. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for inviting us, Thomas.